with myself, a few board members will be here. We have our president, our vice president, a few others, our membership directors. They'll be here greeting everyone, just saying hello. As far as YHPAA current events go, we have a bunch of stuff coming up. Let me first tell you about our annual Unidos por Nuestro Futuro Gala. This year it's going to be virtual, and it's going to be held on Saturday, October 10th at 5 p.m. This event is free. Suggested donations. Donations do help us just with our mission of providing scholarships to students, and then we will be honoring some community leaders. Another reminder, very important, last day to register to vote will be Monday, October 5th, if you haven't done so already. I just checked today on, I think it's vote.org, to make sure that I was in fact registered, because I'm paranoid like that. And yes, I am registered. So if you don't know if you're registered, go ahead and check online. It's super easy to do so. And we will actually be hosting an event. So we'll be doing a Facebook Live on our YHPAA page. And we will be just discussing some voting FAQs. I know the city's going to be having a drive-through registration booth where you can easily just drop off your registration form. We're going to be going through the ballot, what's on your ballot, how to research your ballot, how to properly fill out your ballot. I found out the other day some reasons why your ballot might get tossed out, which is crazy that it took me this long in life to find that out. But we'll be going over all that on our Facebook Live at YHPAA, and that's YHPAA. Also, don't forget, guys, we will be actually live tweeting today. We have some of our membership directors live tweeting, Josh and Sylvia. I think Josh is taking the lead on that. But again, our Twitter is YHPAA, YHPAA. And for our speaker, follow him as well at Jelani Consult, Jelani Consult. And let's see, a couple more things here, bear with me. So this is our third installment of our Unidos Avanzamos series. So this one is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Action versus Words. So what prompted YHPAA to create this series was in response to the current climate around Black Lives Matter movement. This cause is huge for our nation and also brings up a number of conversations within the Latinx community. Our board is committed to having these hard conversations and providing a platform for educating and change against racism. The Young Hispanic Professional Association of Austin, YHPAA, was founded in 2006 and aims to provide leadership and development opportunities for young Latinx professionals to empower and connect to the greater Austin community. So if any of that sounds interesting to you all, please feel free to reach out to us if you aren't already members. Like I mentioned earlier, Josh and Sylvia are hanging out here, or visit our website, yhpaa.org, to become a member. Now, let's get to the fun stuff. With me today, our speaker is Kazique Prince, PhD, don't forget those credentials at the end. He is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Jelani Consulting, LLC, here in Austin, which helps provide executive consultation and coaching services focused on cultural competency for individuals, teams, and organizations. Dr. Prince also serves as Senior Policy Advisor and Education Coordinator for City of Austin Mayor Steve Adler. In the Mayor's office, education, equitable economic development, and public safety are under his portfolio, as well as efforts to develop, plan, and execute strategies to dismantle institutional racism and systemic inequalities, promote equity and inclusion, and meet strategic goals within the Mayor's agenda. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Kazique.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm really excited to kind of talk with you guys about some of the work and hopefully learn something. I imagine there'll be some good ideas that we share in our time together today. So thank you again.
No, thank you for joining us. We're super honored and excited to have you. Um, and I would like to, you know, your bio was amazing, and I was trying to cut out what I could. So if I missed anything, please, you're more than welcome
Oh.
to add some more.
Well, just a little bit. The things that actually are most important to me is I'm a father. I'm a dad. My kids call me Papi, and that's the thing I wake up with in my mind pretty much every day. They're not little babies anymore, but they are my babies, and that's what motivates me and drives me day to day for the work that I do. So um, that's those are things most important to me.
Oh, that's so sweet. Everybody call your parents.
And I do want to say hi to a few folks who are online. I see Brian Oakes, who's the Chief Equity Officer for the City of Austin. A couple of my friends, Joelle and Kathy, who are some stalwart folks here in the recruitment of lawyers in the area, focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and other things. And so I just want to say thank you. And if I didn't see you, I do see you in my heart. And just thank you guys for being here today.
That's awesome. Hi, everyone. So I think first and foremost, right, with our first question, let's get down to nitty gritty. What can you please explain what DE&I means to you?
You know, if it was just about, I think where we started off, decades ago about getting more people of color jobs, if that was all it was about, I don't think we would survive. For me, real basically what diversity, equity, inclusion is about, and if I may add belonging, it's about freedom. It's about opportunity. It's about love. It's about liberation. Um, it's all about that. The end goal of all of this is ultimately the liberation of people who have been oppressed, who've been marginalized, who've been sent to the margins and expected to somehow survive on little or nothing, and to be thankful for being subjugated. And what this is a pathway to away from that lifestyle, that delegation in society, and to live a life that is a sense of fullness, where you can be average or mediocre and not be attributed to your race. Uh, those are the kinds of things that I think DEI is about. Um, and fundamentally, if that's not the kind of the leading kind of reason behind what we do, that love, that affirmation, that sense of fairness and living, um, then I'm not sure what this is really about in the first place. Um, while we do focus on things like getting people jobs and having opportunity, those jobs lead us to do the things we want to do for our families, for our communities, or if we choose to do nothing and be selfish. The point is that we are allowed to live to our fullness and have ourselves manifest. Um, but also, I do also think that DEI is about healing, right? Because look at all the pain and misery that has been passed down through the generations and passed to people of color and women and other groups that have been subjugated. There is a place for healing that needs to be also identified, because I think what happens is that we if we just say, well, stop being racist, stop being sexist, stop being a jerk, and then everything's fine, when in truth, there's still healing that needs to be manifested in each of us. And I think that's part of the conversation that sometimes is neglected, is that need for telling the truth. And as we used to say in the Black church, naming and claiming and calling it out, and shame the devil and tell the truth. And I think if you do these kinds of things of healing, then you're less likely to transfer that pain and that hurt and that misery further. You're able to stop it in its tracks and really allow people to live more fully. And for me, that's what DEI and belonging is really about.
I like how you add the word belonging to it.
Yeah, and that's something we've seen over the last, don't quote me, but I would say the last 10, 15 years. You see it in the literature. And because I have two thoughts about this, and it may not be all that revolutionary, but the whole point behind diversity, equity, inclusion was in organizations to feel like you actually belong, like you're a part of something, that you could be yourself and be affirmed in that organization, right? The good thing about that is it speaks to the intentionality behind the work that we're focusing on as you're doing all the things that many of us are doing in this space. The only challenge that sometimes I have is that people try to sometimes look at belonging by itself in isolation, separate from the work that we're doing around diversity, equity, inclusion. And to me, they're interconnected. They build upon one another. There's almost like a legacy that we're building upon. And more recently, again, we've been talking about belonging because I think what people are concerned about is that what is this all for? How do we make sure that everyone's part of this? This is not just about women and people of color and people with living with disabilities. This is about all folks being included and being a part of this. But then how do you pull those resources? How do you make them feel like they're a part of something that's meaningful? Um, and so as long as the belonging maintains is connected to the work around diversity, equity, inclusion, then I think we're achieving, or at least attempting to achieve what we need to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that work, and I'm sure most of us can attest to, belonging to DE and I groups if we aren't already part of it, or maybe we want to start them. In your experience, how can an organization or individuals make DE and I happen within the workplace or somewhere else? Is it starting a small group within your company, or is it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, bringing an outside company in for a day of a
Mm-hmm.
workshop?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that and everything and all of it, right? But it depends on where you want to start, right? Every organization is in a bit of a different place, and let's just use an example for this organization. You're a young professional, you've joined the organization, and you've noticed some things, maybe you've heard some things, maybe you've been there a couple of years, and you've gathered that there's some concerns that are related to diversity, equity, inclusion. Maybe the leadership is not racially diverse. Maybe there's been some incidents within the organization that you feel that reflect the mission and values. Maybe who you serve is not reflected in who is employed in the organization. Maybe you're noticing something, but you're at the grassroots of the organization, right? And you're wondering, how do I get this conversation going? And so I think one of the first steps you take is finding out who are your allies in this organization, whether it be your peers, are there folks up higher up in the organization who are also interested? There's a lot of people who are talking about this right now, but really knowing who are your co-conspirators in this work, I think is one of your first jobs, because you cannot do this by yourself. You cannot do this in isolation. Even when the organization decides to hire or hire a consultant or a chief equity officer or diversity officer, that person by themselves cannot create the kind of meaningful dynamic change that's necessary. So knowing who your partners in crime is going to be, I think, in many ways, your first step. And then spending some more time listening. Oftentimes you'll see chief equity officers do a listening tour to figure out what are the challenges, what are some of the concerns, because oftentimes leadership is a little bit, assuming they're interested, unaware of what the challenges that organization might be experiencing are in this space. They know about financial issues. They know about whether they're meeting their goals as far as their business is concerned. They know how many dollars they may need to raise to serve a certain community, but they don't know what the internal dynamics are going on between people, because oftentimes people don't share the sexist comments and the racism and the biases, whether subtle or not. Oftentimes they don't feel like they're empowered to, or they can. And so when you're spending time learning about what's going on by having conversations with people, but doing things like, if you get to the stage relatively quickly, or maybe they already have the information where they're doing a survey to get a sense of what's the climate of the organization. It doesn't have to be really intense. It could be something like a really quick survey just to get a sense of what's going on. Those are kind of usually the first steps so you can get a lay of the land. Who are your partners in this work? What are the issues that you're dealing with? And I think by having what essentially ends up being like a needs assessment, then you're able to have some ongoing dialogue about what direction to take. What do you want to do with this information? How transparent do you want to be? Do you need to have officially bring folks together and create a committee? Those are all decisions that can be made based off the information that you've gathered to help kind of give a sense of what the direction is going to be. Hopefully, you're also not just connecting with people within your organization, but people who are doing this kind of work or have this kind of interest outside of the organization, because they might give you some insights about what they've been dealing with and what you're going to find out. They're like, girl, I dealt with that too. And so it's so, and the reason why this is so important, because one, even if you're not familiar with this, yeah, you're interested, but you don't really have the training. You're going to need to have allies in the process, partners, co-conspirators, because what you're going to find out, this is not something that's going to be one and done, simple, a brown bag series, or a committee that meets, once or twice a month or whatever. It's going to be something that's going to take a long time, a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of heartbreak and disappointment. And you're going to need those folks who to support you and lift you up, because this work is not for the faint of heart. I've been saying that for years. It just isn't. And so until you have the people around you who support you and encourage you, not you personally, but the mission and vision and ideas that we're talking about today, then you're going to end up wearing yourself out. And then you'll be so annoyed and frustrated, you're not going to want to do the work in place. And that's kind of a grassroots kind of approach. If you can get buy-in from your leadership, it's even more beautiful. So when I work with an organization and their CEO or executive director is like, I'm all in. I'm like, whoa, sweet. Don't have any problem getting money. Don't have any problem getting staff involved. Even if you have staff who are like, I don't know about this DEI stuff. I'm a this, I'm a that. They're like, yeah, we're doing this. So when you have leadership involved, it's great. It's a beautiful thing. When you don't have their buy-in, it just becomes a struggle. However, great leadership, when you find with great leaders, there's a space where they want to learn. They understand the dynamics. They've probably read information about the business case around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not all of them, but many of them are very intelligent and wise, have had experience, and they need to feel like they can trust someone who's going to give them information, experiences, and anecdotes and data to help them better understand the challenges. And so if you have that, even if they're not totally on board, but they're willing to learn and acknowledge that maybe they don't know this space very well, but they want to because it's going to make the business better, that's a pretty good situation to be in too. What doesn't work, and I want to be real clear, when people are not bought in, when leadership is like, we're not doing this, when you're in the organization and people are just like poo-pooing you and shutting you down, and you can't find allies around you, the question you might be asking yourself, is this an organization I want to be a part of? Because you're going to run into this challenge over and over. You're going to complain about comments that people say, and people are going to say, you're making a big deal out of nothing. You might ask yourself, is this where I want to be the next 5-10 years? And I think that's a reality that we all have to kind of ask ourselves. And I also realize it's a privilege to even think about that, because for a lot of those folks, we're just trying to keep our job, stay alive, and survive. And so the idea of having to leave is like, but the question I ask is this going to sustain you? Is this going to uplift you? Are there other things you can do while you're looking for another job, so you not have to be in an organization that, I'll be honest, is not feeding you the way you need to be fed?
All of that. But the part about the allies, the part about it's not easy work, and I mean, I think we're learning this, hosting these series, it's not easy work, but I'm also part of another diversity and inclusion group. And we wanted to, in the height of Black Lives Matter movement, and we wanted to release a press release saying, we're donating, and this is why we support Black Lives Matter. The board gave us so much pushback, and it's incredible to that they wanted to form this group, and yet we were getting pushback. And to have those allies in the group of committee people with me who said, we stood firmly together and we said, no, we're going to do this, and this is what it's going to take, and we're going to make it happen. So yes, allies. Oh, that part. Yeah. So on the topic of companies, um, what is the approach a company should take with understanding the different perspectives of employees?
Well, I'm biased. I'm trained psychologist, and so I love research. I love gathering data. I think when organizations trying to better understand the climate of their organization or what the issues that they're dealing with, I think they have to be open to collecting information in different ways. You know, when leadership goes around and talks to their employees and assuming they feel comfortable to share their experiences, or management to talk about, hey, what's going on? What are the biggest challenges? What do you think is the number one challenge that my organization is dealing with? That kind of open-ended question sometimes can, and not to be too vague, you know, what's the number one issue organization is dealing with around diversity, equity, inclusion? That might be a really basic question that you go out to your organization and ask them and have some conversations about it, right? Um, and you might do that through a survey, you might do that in conversation, but part of the challenge is sometimes organizations, depending on the culture, will um, will value certain kinds of information over others, meaning they'll see data, only really good data is survey data, right? And interviews are somehow not as important. They're both valuable. And my training has shown me that they serve in many ways sometimes different purposes, but they're still very, very valuable. And then the question for me is, how do I use that to better dig deep in my understanding of the organization? And so to me, that's one of the first steps, and taking the time to do it right. But also being mindful of not letting perfection be the thing that gets in the way. You know, you don't want things to be absolutely perfect, because that's the system of white supremacy. That's things have to be perfect and take a long time and delay, and then you never do it. But really, you know, get in there, do something relatively quick and short. It's a low hanging fruit that gets you, you know, germinating ideas and thinking about what's going on. Because every question should lead to another question.
Thank you. So I wanted to, and I've mentioned this to you earlier, touch upon last night's debate. Um, just some current events for everyone. So, how can we uh, just convince those who kind of are who steer clear of DE&I workshops and DE&I groups in their companies and organizations, and truly, really demonstrate the effectiveness of these groups and workshops and the value?
Right. Well, and I'm glad you asked this, because I think one of the things, and you may be referencing, but back yesterday, but he's been saying this for several weeks.
Okay.
He does not believe that critical race theory, the diversity, equity, inclusion workshops are they have a place in federal government. He thinks they teach people that to be anti-American. Matter of fact, I think he even said last night that they're racist. Um,
Mhm.
of course, I don't believe any of that is true. As I started off earlier in our conversation, diversity, equity, inclusion is about fairness. It's about liberation. It's about finding a place that fits and where you can be yourself. Um, and so, um, but the challenge is that you're always going to have a percentage of folks who are just, it's not going to resonate for them. It's not going to make sense to them. It feels like a bunch of communism or whatever it may sound. And I think, as a consultant, I have to appreciate that. I don't have to agree with it, but I do have to understand it, right? And one of the things I've received in my training as a psychologist is this idea of stages of change, right? And stages of change is this idea that depending where a person is along the continuum will give me a sense of how ready they are to create change in their life. Some people, you ain't got to convince them. Matter of fact, they've tried some things out and failed, and they're just looking to try something else out they feel like it's going to work, and they're ready to go. And that's a lot of people. That's a lot. I would say I don't know about most people, but a lot of people are looking for something to do. They're like, I want to make a difference in the world. I want to make a change. Those are low lift, not so hard folks to so-called convince. There's nothing to convince. There's other people who maybe haven't done a whole lot in this space, but if they feel like it's, or they think, or maybe they've come across some information that tells them this is the right thing, I should be doing something, but they don't know where to start. That's another group. So again, you have to convince them. You just have to, they're looking for something to create change. It's kind of like someone who's trying to lose weight. They're looking for the right diet that works for them, right? The right book or whatever. Then you have another group of people who could be convinced, but they're not really there. They're not aware as much of the problem. They've heard a few things here and there, but they're not going to be there for a little bit. You got to give them a little time. And then you have another group who's totally oblivious, who's not just not interested, but not even concerned, and sometimes are like they're aware of some of the things, but they're like, that's nonsense. They just discount the entire thing. Those are folks that I'll be honest, I don't spend a lot of time on. I don't abandon them. I don't say, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm going to ignore you. I see them, I hear them, I listen to them, I offer my support if there's information they want to, I might be able to provide for them. I be a space for them to be part of that if that's something that they are looking for. If not, I might direct them to someone else. But I don't spend a lot of time on that because my job is not to necessarily convince them. My job is to be present because there might be an opportunity in the future that I can connect to. So the folks who we're really talking about are the folks who are in between, who don't really know how this connects to who they are. They don't know what their place, how does this diversity, equity, inclusion fit for me? And generally we think about white people in this space, but this could be anyone. Where they're just like, what is this? Why is this the part? I just don't get it. I don't know what my role is. And for that person, it's information, it's experiences, it's getting them outside of their comfort zone, allowing them some healing, because sometimes they've had some trauma around these conversations where they started a conversation about race and racism and maybe said something dumb and people cussed them out. So now they're gun shy. Or they went to a diversity, equity, inclusion training and they they felt forced to do something they didn't feel comfortable with. And I'll give you an example. I went to a course that talked about LGBTQ issues. This is years ago. And the facilitator came in and says, say these words, I am gay. At the time, saying that was very difficult for me. And I walked away. This is someone who I'm a loving person. I want to do the right thing. I'm training to be a psychologist. I want to help people, right? But the trainer's like, say these words. And I was having difficulty saying it because I was not in the space that I felt comfortable saying that because I didn't feel like that was true to who I was as a person. And I would not say words that are not true. I almost kind of was indignant about it, right? But that wasn't the point. She was trying to expose me to a different experience and really challenge me. And it was part of my journey out of that space into another space. I give that as an example because sometimes it may not come to them in that moment. When they come to my training, it may not convince them all the way that this is something they need to be doing. But it's likely in a series of things that get them there. They just need time to get there in their own time. And usually who convinces them are the people that they care about, who care about them. And they're like, through their experiences, they're like, oh, okay, I'm ready. And that's how you deal with folks who are in that space. Acknowledging there's some people that just are not willing or want to, but there's others who want to, but they're just struggling to figure out how does it fit for them. And the unique role I play as a consultant, whether it's leadership or others, is trying to figure out why is this important to them.
Yeah, I'm honing in on those specifics to each person. So our next question is, how would you handle a situation where someone in a position of power within an organization is being culturally insensitive, homophobic, racist, etc.? I think many of us in this chat room have experienced this, unfortunately.
You know, that's always a hard one, right? Because when you're dealing with, people say that people are conflict avoidant. The truth is, and I learned this from a friend, it's the confrontation that we don't like. We deal with conflict all the time, right? Someone gets into the crosswalk when you're driving your car, that's a conflict, right? But the confrontation is what we struggle with. Like, what is that conversation going to look like? I think many of us have learned is when you call someone racist or sexist, people don't seem to respond to that very well. And so oftentimes what we have been led to believe that's another strategy is to talk about our experience of what they say. When you said these words, I felt this. You know, respect to those good old I statements we learned back in elementary school.
Yeah.
It still applies. But what you're trying to do is parse out the part that's yours and your experience of those words or those behaviors and calling them out in a way that feels, because we're wanting to avoid attacking people. But I think part of the concern is that sometimes people are doing that and there's a worry that you're spending too much time worrying about them and their fragility, assuming they're white and you're dealing with a race issue. But even if you're dealing with men and their fragility, there's concern that you don't want to placate them or play soft gloves with them, and sometimes they just need to be called out. But one of the things I'm aware of, and I think many of you people who are here are aware of it, there's a power dynamic you're dealing with, right? I remember when I had a supervisor, I was an intern, and he said, "What's up, boy?" I just froze. I mean, generally who I am is I'm from Fifth Ward. I'm from the Nickel. I'm gonna bust you in your mouth. That's the first part of my brain. But I am trying to be a professional who is in school, trying to become a doctor. I need to come up with another language. And eventually, in that situation happened is that he corrected himself and he came back and apologized. But in all honesty, I go back to the situation of there's the power dynamic. What do I say? And there's different ways of doing it. I could say something to him. I might say something to an ally in an organization, whether it be a supervisor or someone else. Maybe I need to spend some time thinking about what my strategy is going to be and talk with someone else about what I should or shouldn't do. These are all avenues about how you want to navigate that situation. I would recommend that somehow or another you have to figure out how to confront that issue, have that conversation, and letting people know that it was bothersome. Um, tell them how you truly feel, that you feel comfortable sharing. Because the concern is that if you just cuss them out, then what they're going to do is focus on your behavior as the problem, even though that's really not the problem, but they're going to make that the problem. So how do you share your concern, share your frustration, you're feeling disrespected or whatever, fill in the blank, and have that conversation, even if that means having a third person be there as an intervention. So maybe you go through your HR department, not so there's necessarily a write-up, but maybe they're intervening on your behalf to have the conversation and help you navigate it more effectively. So I'm giving you several different options. And I also want to be honest. Sometimes the other option for some of you is going to do nothing. And you may feel like that's your best option. I personally would hope that you use one of the other options I presented to you. But I also want to be a reality that for some of you really feel like there is nothing you can do, or you may feel like this doesn't come up to the standard or the threshold that you want to say something. And that's also an option. Again, it's not the one I always like to talk about, but I don't want to pretend like it's not out there when actually it is. Does that make sense?
It does. And so for someone who is going to call out the situation, would you recommend they maybe, pull that person aside or call it out right then and there? Or does it reflect on maybe your personality?
I mean, there's a personality thing, right? Some people are direct communicators and they want you to come straight to them if you have a concern, and they will have no problem with that kind of conversation. And you will pull them to the side. You'll take some time. So, my personal style is to take some time to think about it, get my thoughts right, to get my mind right, and to have that conversation. Say, I really want to sit down and talk with you about something that happened the other day or what happened earlier today. And this is my experience. That's, to me, has worked really well. One of my best friends, I remember one time I had hurt her feelings, and something was a bit sexist. As someone who I love and care about and respect, I said something really stupid. And it wasn't until she came, I think, the next day and sat me down and said, "Hey, Kazique, when you said this, it made me feel diminished and like I didn't matter." And I was like, oh, it broke my heart because I love her as a friend. And so that conversation was really powerful for me to change my behavior. And to be honest, I'm so glad that she spoke with me because now it gave me an opportunity to do something different. So definitely those one-on-one situations are a good time to have those conversations. But I'm giving you as an example of a friend, a friend colleague I had. Um, um, I think that same strategy can be useful for for people in the work setting where you have that kind of conversation. But also just be mindful of the dynamics. You may not feel comfortable, especially when you're talking about power differentials. You may not feel comfortable going to this person in their office to have a conversation. That's why I think having HR or having a third party or a supervisor who can be there to witness it at minimum can be just kind of, and maybe even coaches you through it and say, hey, I want to have this conversation with someone. What do you think about this? Oh, that sounds really good. Okay, let's do it. Boom.
Yeah. Yes, because I know personally as someone who called out their coworker right then and there in the moment of the happening, and we were all like, "Ooh, this is kind of awkward." So yeah, maybe
That's
that one on
hard.
one.
I don't want to say that's not an option. These are all options, right? And sometimes some person needs to be called out right there. Say, hey, that's and some people joke, they use humor. That's diet racist. That's low calorie racist you just threw out there. But sometimes when you use humor, it diminishes it unnecessarily. Sometimes it's real simple. It doesn't have to necessarily be a big thing. So I feel like what you just said may be a bit racist, and this is why I think it's racist. And they'd be like, what? I didn't know that, or that's a derogatory term. The person may not know that, and it might be squashed right there.
Hmm.
And so again, I don't want to say that's not an option, but sometimes it's awkward. But you know what? This work requires us to be uncomfortable. And I don't think the discomfort of having the conversation should necessarily dissuade us from having the conversation, even if it is out in the open sometimes. It may not be the one I choose all the time, but that's my style. Your style may be, that's one. It's like my ex-wife used to say, you get it where you dealt it. uh, you know,
And
sometimes that's the
sometimes
way.
it's
Sometimes you just have to pull out the belt and whoop them right there, and that's
yeah.
okay. Call it out. Again, I hope you hear from me is that there's an array of different ways of dealing with it. No one of them is necessarily the best, depending on the circumstances, depending on your own style of communication and how you typically. The point is doing something, knowing that you do have the option of doing nothing. But I think you and I both know that oftentimes perpetuates the problem. And I think we need to
Absolutely.
empower people to feel like they have the option to say something and find resolution and not feel like there's going to be consequences, because that's the kind of environment of belonging requires to be able to call those things out. Diversity inclusion doesn't mean we never have these instances. It's the way we manage them when they arise, not if, when.
Hmm.
Because sexism and racism and homophobia do not end like magical. They're going to happen. Do we have the environment where people can manage them and deal with them effectively and create the environment where I can be myself and have challenges and be uncomfortable and grow as a result and find redemption? Because if I make a mistake, I have to be able to find some redemption too, right?
Hmm.
I was that friend who loved her but said some sexist stuff. If she never gave me a path to redemption, we couldn't be friends. So all those things I think are necessary for us to be successful in the kind of environment that's going to be useful for us all.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so we have one more question before we open it up to our live Q&A, and I already see some questions filtering into our chat. But let's see here. What is your understanding today as to how Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience at work?
Say it one more time for me. I'm sorry.
How is your understanding today as to how Black, Indigenous, and people of color their experience at work, so their experiences currently at work?
What the experience is currently like at work? I mean,
Yes.
it depends on what your position is. Truthfully, we still have people having experiences in jobs where speaking languages other than English are frowned upon. Maybe not on policy, but just in general, where people are being told not to do it. These are things that are happening right now as we speak. There are people who are being, because they wear their hair natural, are being frowned upon and not given promotion because they're not seen as being professional. There are people who, because of their style of speak, is considered, again, not professional or too black or too whatever. Their accent is frowned upon. So all of these things have not, we're still in the middle of the belly of the beast, you know? And so while this doesn't mean we haven't made improvements, if you ask my grandfather, rest his soul, God rest his soul, he'll tell you things are better because when he back in his day, he was running from white folks, hiding in the cemetery because there was some incident happened, and so the only way he could survive was to leave the house and hide in the cemetery in the dark, and sit and stay there for days until he felt like he can come out. For him, things are better in some ways, but the other things are still present. There's still people who just they join an organization. There's still, there's nonprofits and business across the city in Austin, across this country, where people are feeling very alone and isolated. Don't feel like they have to feel like they have to fit in that nice little middle, comfortable compartment, cause no waves, be a team player, be a cultural fit, and not bring any attention to themselves. That's where a lot of people of color are. That's where a lot of us are just. I mean, not a lot of people know this. I go by Kazique. I've changed my name legally to Kazique, but my given name, my birth name, is Kevin. I know for a fact my mother gave me that name because she wanted me to have a nice, safe name. It's a nice Gaelic Irish name that means handsome and noble. And with
I'm
that
right
kind of
there
name,
with you.
you know what I'm saying? And with that kind of name, you put down a job application. I remember one of my first jobs in college, I worked at Whataburger, and I sent him a resume. I had with all my job experience, which wasn't a much. It was KFC and another job at Whataburger. So I gave my job experience. It said Kevin Prince. And I walk in the door and he's like, "Can I help you?" I'm like, "I'm Kevin." He's like, he had that look of shock. Like, "Oh, you're not quite the person I thought was coming in." Because I had talked to him on the phone. If you've seen that movie, I forget the name of the movie, where he has the white voice on the phone. And it's just something
Sorry
I
to bother
passed.
you.
Yeah, sorry to bother
Yes.
you. That's why that's why the movie's so funny, right? Because I learned from my family. You get on the phone, you have your professional voice. My mother, could just fall on the ground and be, like any other black mother I know, when she was the executive director, she would get on the phone and says, "Hello, this is Sandra Turlington. How can I help you?" And I learned that watching her. She would do speeches. She'd get on the phone and have her work laugh. That's so. You're such a joy to be around. And so I learned that, and I used it because there's advantages that come with it, right? And so I think, but naming myself Kazique, uh, uh, being willing to take the risk to be myself in more and more settings, is part of my liberation. It's part of my own
So where
personal
did you get?
liberation. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Where did you get Kazique? The name Kazique.
Glad you asked. Kazique is, I spent a lot of time trying to find a name. Um, and first I went with a name that came from West Africa, and it was the day of the week. It just didn't roll off my lips. But I came across Kazique. I forgot how I found it. And it's a Caribbean name. It's actually of the native Tainos. And it actually kind of worked for me because, as I mentioned to you before we got on, my ex-wife is Puerto Rican. My kids are part Puerto Rican. So to me, it was my way of connecting with my kids. And it means chief, leader, medicine person. In some parts of Latin America, unfortunately, it also means overseer or drug lord. Um, we won't talk about that, but yes.
I can totally relate to the name though. My mother named me Angela and no middle name. Angela, no middle name to borrow. Very basic, very trying to make our lives easier when we came to this
Well, what are
country.
we dealing with? What are our parents dealing with? They're dealing with people being called out because their name is too ethnic. They can't get a job. They're just you're too much. I mean, I remember when I had braids. I was a social worker in the Bronx. I had braids and an afro, and I came home to visit my mom, and she's like, "Are you gonna get a job?" I'm like, "Mom, I got a job, but a real
Oh,
job, one that pays money."
yeah. But it's true. It's that movement now, like you mentioned, with we're starting to rock our natural hair. I know us, I am for sure. I've straightened my hair for 27 years, and now this last year I've totally natural, never ever before in my life. And I had similar reaction to my mom. She's like, "It looks so unprofessional." I'm like, "What's unprofessional?" about the real us.
Yes, 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 unfortunately.
Yeah. But thank you for answering all that. It's been super insightful. I just want to flip it over to some questions. If you guys, I'm going to start with some questions that I have here in our message board. But if you do have some questions after I'm done, feel free to unmute yourselves and put the camera on so we can see your lovely faces. So this first one here says, what should an organization prioritize with their DE&I efforts to maximize impact?
Yeah, I would say one of the first things you want to do is who are the people who want to be on board with this effort, right? Finding those allies and conspirators, I think, is one of your first steps. I would say the immediate next step is, and it's similar but different, is what are your resources available to you to do this work, right? All too often, you see this in higher education, you see this in corporate America, where the women and the people of color get burdened with all this work, right? And we're supposed to do all the mentoring and the committee work. Sorry, that's my dog. 1 second. I can hear myself. But there's no resources to compensate us for our time. And so the other question that needs to be, I think, as quickly as possible answered is how do we allocate resources toward this effort? And oftentimes when I work with an organization, I say, it's not going to cost you this much, but this is how much you should be thinking about is 1% of your profits or 1% of your annual budget. So when you start thinking about those numbers, that should give you some idea of what this is going to take. And the way I put it in context, and this is all about setting the ground for what this is about. This is not something you're going to be one and done. This is something we'll commit to. This is like building a new building. This is an investment. This requires people power. It requires resources. And if we're going to do this, this is what I need you to be thinking about. But the way to start is finding your allies in the organization who are interested. And even if it's just a handful of people, 2, 3, 4 people, that's okay. You got to start with something.
Mm-hmm. I am so sorry. I was actually supposed to switch it over to Joshua.
Oh, cool.
Sorry,
Josh was
Josh.
like, I got a job. Give that man his job back.
I was too excited. I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize, Angela. You've been doing great. Yeah, awesome. Great. So Kazique, thank you so much for everything that you've been saying. Certainly, we've gotten a lot of interest through our various platforms and everything. I'm just going to go into a few of the questions that we've received.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. So the first one, we had discussed about navigating the workplace, and certainly that kind of course, is top of mind right now, especially with the pandemic, with people working in different environments. And the question we received is around being bilingual, multilingual, and I'm going to read this verbatim. The question is, how are we supposed to handle having the capability to speak two languages and at times expected to translate for others in the workplace, many times as a favor, but not to be compensated? Makes it seem like asking to be compensated for work, ability to speak two languages, that they're not being a team player. So the question really is around if or how employers should compensate bilingual, multilingual speaking staff. Sounds as though this person, if speaking from experience, it feels like they're being taken advantage of. But
I'm glad you asked that question, and I think they are. If my job is finance, that's my job, right? But we're sitting in a meeting, and there's about 20 of us around the table, and they say, hey, we need to get a graphic design for this project, for this event that we're putting together. And we don't really have a lot of money for that, or we don't have any money for that. Could someone do that? Well, I'm a finance person, but back in college, I used to do all kinds of graphic design. Matter of fact, I still do things for my church and nonprofits I work with and blah, blah, blah. I got a skill set. If that's something I do on a regular basis, one thing I have to do once in a while for that one project. That's just me being, maybe a little bit of a team player. I'm offering something up as an additional skill set. But it's something I'm expected to do. Now you've made that part of my job. I should be compensated for that. And I think there should be some conversations with your supervisor, with HR, that this is something that's an ongoing practice. It's part of your job, that you're supposed to be somehow translating things and intervening or being a mediator or whatever it may be to help with the translation or interpretation of whatever the language you have skills in. That should be something that's part of your job, and you should be compensated for it. The question is how to have that conversation. And so I think keeping track of the times that you're having to do the kind of work, every time that happens, if you feel like that's just, when someone walks in the door and it's like, hey, where's Bobby? If that's something that's just on a regular, ongoing basis, you might keep track of it and say, hey, I've noticed over the last 2 or 3 months, this is something I've spent this amount of time on. I've been called on this many times. I feel like this is a certain portion of my position. And it's invaluable because this is a resource. Because if you weren't there, chances are they wouldn't have someone to do it. And so they need to be thinking about, what does it cost for them not to have that? So what you're doing is monetizing the value you bring to organization, and it takes away this idea that this is a kind of a crunchy, huggy, kumbaya kind of like, let's go out and hug each other, diversity, equity, inclusion. No, this is about dollars, y'all. This is about getting paid. And when you're doing something enough that consumes your time and energy and your expertise and experience, you need to get paid for it. You need compensated for it. And sometimes what you have to do is track it, make a case for it, and talk with the right people to, at minimum, to say, this is what I, should be compensated for doing this kind of work. Now, separate question is whether it'll happen, but at least you've made the case for it. And I want to encourage you to make the case as best you can, because it is a resource.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And the next question we have goes to, speaking about having conversations within the company, kind of on the company side, the question we received is, how can companies better encompass the inclusion aspect of DE&I? I feel like most companies I have worked for do great at diversity, equity, but fall short on inclusion. They usually expect a level of assimilation.
Right. There's a cultural fit, your team player, all that stuff, right? Because there's a culture, right? And people want you to fit into that culture. The point of inclusion is that you're going to hire some people who don't, matter of fact, you want people who don't fit into the culture, right? It's the whole group think. There's this whole psychology that came out after, I think, World War II, because they were worried about the dictators and fascists. They said, well, how did that happen? Well, it happened because you had group think, because you had people think common thought and common thinking, and it led to the problems we had. That plays out in organizations. You can't be as innovative and creative if you have group think, where everyone's thinking alike or behaving alike or have the same backgrounds. So you need to pull people in who are disruptors. You should be intentional in saying, we need someone who's part of the team who's going to ask those questions no one else asks. Not just one people, but a couple of people. Who are going to drive disruption, not in a way that's disrespectful necessarily, and that's a vague term, I know, but intentionally are trying to disrupt the system in such a way to create change so you can find the innovations and the creativity is necessary. And so the way of making sure that happens is making it sure it's part of, assuming it's a purpose-driven or mission-driven organization, making sure it's one of the values, it's in your mission, but my friend Brian Oakes will tell you this, you have to operationalize it with some clear goals that you're trying to achieve. And so whether it's your hiring practices, whether it's your recruitment, whether it's people's longevity in the organization, it's promotion, how many people of color and women are in your leadership, all those things can be operationalized in such a way that you can set goals for yourself with certain systems or procedures or processes that you implement to achieve those goals. If you do those things over a period of time and really aggressively, not even aggressively, just go after them, you'll see that you'll create the kind of change you're looking for. But it has to be written down. It has to be in the meat of the organization. It has to be in the DNA of the organization, because the alternative is nothing. Non-racist, non-racist, but better said, the kind of colorblind mindset. Because we have good hearts, good things are going to happen. Nope, you got to put it in there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. At this point, I'm just scrolling down the comments section. Certainly for those on the line, if you can go ahead and put the questions in the group chat, or if you feel so inclined, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, turn on your video to ask the question. I just want to scroll through and just take a quick pause as I do so. Again, any questions, you can go to the group chat or go ahead and unmute yourself. And Kazique, as we're kind of waiting for others to ready themselves, I had a question of my own that I kind of wanted to bring up because someone touched upon assimilation, and that's more of a prompt than a question or a multi-level question on my part. A few years ago, I had first heard this term, code switching. And it kind of upon hearing about it, it really opened up my mind because, just to put myself out there, I'm multiracial. So even within my own family, my own environment, I did find myself code switching, talking to people differently who I had known for years and years. And in hindsight, I definitely find myself doing that in social and professional situations. Mm-hmm. If you could provide some context on for those that don't know what code switching is, but also how minorities have dealt with that, how they struggle with that or use that to their advantage. I'd certainly love to hear your thoughts.
Oh yeah, code switching is old school. It's been around since Methuselah. It's fundamentally the way that many of us, in a sense, it's an adaptation skill, where we will change our body language and our words and even how we enunciate words in a certain way to adapt to a particular expectation, particular cultural expectation. And so for me, what that translates is what I talked about earlier, where you get on the phone and you have your professional white voice, right? Because at home, my southern drawl comes out, my blackness comes out in so many ways, but when I'm on the phone, all of a sudden I have this white sounding voice, right? And it's in some ways about the respectability politics that many of us are having to deal with, where you're not speaking proper English, and you want to be seen in a favorable light, and you want to be judged negatively. You don't want opportunities to be. You don't want an opportunity to be passed. You to be passed by on an opportunity. And so all of that's an attempt to really deal with white supremacy that tells you that you have to behave a certain way that's proper and acceptable. And oftentimes the purveyors of that are not just white Americans, but that's why I say white supremacy, because oftentimes we adopt those as people of color, right? And say that's the standard, right? That's the part I have a problem with it, because now it's kind of that's the standard and that's the only option you have. As another way of looking about it, there was ways that I would code switch depending on who I was talking to. So example is when I would talk to my ex's her grandmother, I would go up to her in my best Spanish and say bendición. I am code switching. That is not something I generally do. Mm-hmm. But when in her presence, because I respect and love her, and she loved me to death. I felt like a king when I was around her. But when I saw her, I was like bendición. And I would kind of not cower, but I would kind of like, she was real short. She's about 4'11". I would kind of get down and say, bendición, so good to see you. She'd give me a blessing. That's me code switching. Because it's a language and a way of being with her, of showing her deference and respect and all that. Now, when I'm done, I go back to talking how I usually talk, right? But those are the things that we do in certain settings, so we're understood at minimum. Because sometimes people may have difficulty understanding what you're saying, and so you'll code switch to adapt to that situation. Many people who travel across the globe they'll do it almost unconsciously, where you're still speaking English, but you might change how you speak or whatever to kind of adapt. And this is not just the words you use; it's the language. But let's be clear, it's not always really simple. There's the baggage of respectability politics, dealing with white supremacy, and then there's a genuine skill set that is necessary when you're dealing with people, where you code switch to make sure what you're saying lands the way you intended, right? Uh, the difference is your choice to do it or not. I can choose not to do that. In other spaces, we didn't have the choice, and we suffered consequences, sometimes the loss of life for not doing it. Because if I spoke up and say, oh, you look really nice today, lady, I could lose my life because I was a young black man talking to a white woman and I was being uppity. That way of behaving, I could lose my life. And it's not funny, it's just messed up. But those are the kinds of situations we've had to deal with as a society. And I think that's why it's still controversial, because people are saying, well, just be yourself. I'm keeping it real. I'm keeping it 100. The way you talk to your parents who you respect oftentimes is not going to look the way you talk to your friends and family, other family. I mean, we code switch all the time. Oftentimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's abrupt. In itself, I think it's not an evil or good skill set. It's something that's necessary. The concern I have is what are the consequences if you don't? And for some people, it's your livelihood, and livelihood, and I don't think that should be the consequence if you choose to not code switch. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. Thank you. Thank you for providing that context, and certainly being a psychologist, I appreciate professional insight into everything. And again, for those of us, looks like one or two may have dropped off and then dropped back right on, who may have missed my announcement. Please enter any questions into the group chat. And we did have let's see, another question. I follow up to kind of this thread. Is code switching similar to using, and
I'm not familiar with AAVE.
AAV?
Is that what it said?
Yeah.
It's African American Vernacular English.
Yes, and that came up particularly for some of those who remember. Came out of California. This is that whole conversation around Ebonics. And the thing is, it got trashed like real quick because people are like, you teaching them how to, you're not teaching them proper English. It was a skill set that teachers were actually being taught to better communicate well with students, right? Not just communicating to them, not so they could speak Ebonics, but to really understand their students more deeply. And it was diminished offhand as nonsense. When in actuality, it provided skill sets and insights to educators. And unfortunately, it was abandoned. Not totally. It's still out there, and some people still use it. But it was really a research-based approach to help understand language and how, when students were writing in a certain style, how it was still heavily influenced by African vernacular. And if they understood that, they could better appreciate the writing style of their students. I mean, a lot of the ways that particularly African Americans speak still has a basis in the vernacular that was passed down through the generations from Mother Africa. But people didn't want to believe that. They wanted to believe that all our culture was stripped of us and we had nothing left. And what we know intuitively, but realistically, a lot of those things are still part of who we are, as part of our DNA, and we have not abandoned it, even when we try sometimes.
Great, thank you.
I had a question. This might be actually kind of tangentially related to what you're talking about, but as far you had touched upon a little bit earlier, as far as being able to use the proper languages, using code switching to be able to have success and stuff. But one of the things that I've been kind of really thinking over and thinking about is just the concept of how much of that gives us the message of success coming at the cost of culture. And it's something I've been really trying to struggle, because for one thing, yes, you want to talk professionally, but very much the appearance of professionalism tries very hard to erase our cultural ethnicity and just resembles a homogenous view of a white culture. And so how I guess it's very hard for me to grasp how to approach that, where to try to be able to spread the message that success should not come at the cost of culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you're asking that, because I think what the presumption is that the only success only looks a certain way. And what you find out when you start going around and talking to people right here in Austin, there's some folks who are doing exactly what you're talking about, but the opposite, who are just being themselves, who are keeping it 100, who don't code switch, and they're very successful. We oftentimes don't see them because they're not propped up, they're not on a pedestal somewhere working for so-and-so bank, but they're out there. The question is, how do you build relationships with those folks who are doing that? And so I think what you'll find is that if you do a little research and some digging around, there's folks all around the city from different racial backgrounds, different generations who are successful in their own right, who are keeping it real, who are just who they are, who have their, whether it be their accent or their code switching or the way they dress or how they keep, how they maintain, and they're very successful in their business, in their work. The question that comes up sometimes is, what compromises are you willing to make? Some people, they say, I knew I was never going to be the captain of this ship, but I was okay with just being really good at what I do. I wanted to be a great teacher. And so I didn't want to deal with all that nonsense, and I thought I had to make those compromises, and I didn't want to. So I stayed being a teacher, and what I did, my leadership role was to educate children and do that as best I can, as authentically as I can be. Others, they said, you know what? I decided to start my own business because I didn't want to deal with those folks over there. So I can be the person I want to be. Sometimes you have to, I think what you're going to find is that there's, along your journey, some compromises you're going to ask yourself, are you willing to make? And sometimes you're just not going to want to make those compromises. Then you have to ask yourself, how do you, if possible, create a space where you could be your authentic self and run the kind of business and have the success you're looking for? Hence why a lot of people become entrepreneurs. And one of the things I love about people of color is we're some great entrepreneurs. We will hustle. We'll sell them 8-tracks and cassette tapes and DVDs and whatever out of the back of our cars, and to run our own businesses, to take care of our families. The illusion is that we're going out doing legal stuff all the time. No, most of our entrepreneurship is legal and creative and interesting. I got 3 cousins, I swear, who are selling some type of diet juice fasting something or another, or some cream that you rub on yourself for losing weight. I'm all for it. I don't have to believe in it. I'm all about the entrepreneur, so you can be your own business person, lead your own stuff, and be able to be yourself, because isn't that what that's all about? So you can make money, so you can take care of your family and live out your life the way you want to. The challenge is that if you decide you want to be part of an institution that has certain expectations, is that a compromise that you're willing to take? Sometimes by being in the belly of the beast, being in the system where you maybe made some of those compromises, where you decide to code switch all the time, maybe you feel like that you're playing the role to pull other people up. So you look the part, you're the safe person, but you also have a not so hidden agenda, which is to bring people up. So over a period of time, so they can be themselves. And so while it sounds like I was being critical of my mother, who was worried about me getting a job and giving me a name that was safe, her real intention was for me to be able to have a life I could have, so I could be myself. I was able to do things that she could never even accomplish. I expected my kids to be able to do things that I didn't. So it may sound critical, but I promise you, if I were to go talk to her, she says, maybe I don't agree with everything you do, KP, but I am so glad that this is what I wanted for you, to be happy. Does that answer your question, Ramiro?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, man.
Hey, Kazique, I have a question as well. My organization has recently started doing some of this D&I work by creating D&I councils. A lot of this work is very new for them, and I'm kind of curious on what would be your recommendation as far as how to get people to be a little bit more comfortable with having the conversations necessary to do some of this work. I feel like we have monthly meetings, and bringing up certain conversations with our HR director, who is a white male, sometimes I get, I guess, less confident in these initiatives, given that he doesn't even seem comfortable having the conversations that I think we need to be having. And for me to say that I'm more focused on people of color, like we need to focus on our Black men and women in the company before we're saying, oh, we have a woman as our marketing director while she's a white woman. And they want to start focusing on here's what we're doing good. And I keep trying to say we need to improve in other places. And I've brought up like we need something specific around racism training in the workplace. And it was typed in as a note during the meeting, but now the official PowerPoint that went out, it wasn't in the PowerPoint. So I'm just kind of curious on like, how can I bring up and what could I recommend as being options or resources for them?
Really, is it Angel or Angel?
Angel.
Angel. Thank you for your question. It's a complicated one, but I think there's a few strategies for you to consider. Part of this is acknowledging, as we talked about earlier, that these conversations are going to be uncomfortable. And for some folks, particularly white Americans and sometimes men, because you start bringing issues of gender come up, our reaction is going to be, our fragility is going to show up, right? Because they're like, oh, I don't know. Do we have to talk about that race thing? Do we have to talk about misogyny? And they're going to feel uncomfortable. And that should be expected. It just is, right? But that comes from the philosophy around creating parameters and a foundation that's based off of having, these nonviolent communication. That's one approach. One thing that we promote in my role as the senior policy advisor at the mayor's office, and something we do at the city. We talk about beyond diversity, courageous conversations about race. Also, there's undoing racism. Both of them provide a foundation for how to have these conversations. So in Beyond Diversity, we talk about the 4 agreements, and they have other protocols, but this is a basic one. It talks about speaking your truth. It talks about expecting and accepting discomfort and non-closure. It talks about staying engaged. Those are 4 agreements, 4 principles that they use about how to have these conversations. And there's others to it. And there's a whole training that's for it. Leadership Austin offers it. If you go to Undoing Racism, you'll see that they're offering it in the community. I know they apply that approach over at the city of Austin. But they take you through an entire process about having these conversations, becoming aware of the information that's available to us around race and other biases. And part of this is a place to, build a foundation of understanding and knowledge and awareness, but also giving you tools to walk away with about how to have these conversations. Because that's where I think a lot of us struggle, because for many of us, we've had not so great conversations. I'm not talking about uncomfortable conversations. I'm talking about terroristic conversations where people are shouting and cussing people out. So they want to have that again, and they're fearful. They're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. But these are approaches that the couple I've given you where people find ways of having these conversations in healthy and dynamic ways. And I'll offer you one more. This is the work from Rez McKinnam is how you say his name. And he talks about dirty pain and clean pain. And he talks about the healing that's necessary to have. And so that's less about conversations we have and dialogue we have with one another, and more so about the processes that we take on to calm ourselves, to heal ourselves, so we can have these conversations in a fruitful way. So there's the internal processes that we have, but also the dialogues that we have. And those are just a few options for you to consider. Does that help, Angel?
Yes, thank you.
Cool.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much, Angel, for your question. Kazique, of course, for your answer. We do have another question, and let me see. I have to scroll a little bit, all the great comments and everything I'm seeing in the group chat. The question is, with your consulting, do you focus on DE&I with race and gender, or do you mention the entire scope of DE&I, the handicap, the LGBTQIA, etc.?
Yeah, I lead with race. It's because of, and you see, and I mentioned the city because I think they're doing great work at the city of Austin around this space, and you'll see a similar philosophy. But it's leading with race because it's still one of the main issues that we're dealing with across communities that's just not talked about, and so I lead with that. However, depending on the organization, I help them discover or identify what other issues may be of concern. So some of it, for what's coming up a lot now, is generation. Some people don't think of that as a cultural thing, but it is, because what you're finding is that you have people who are around my age. I'm on Generation X. I turn 50 next year, and we're hiring people who are millennials. And there's oftentimes a lot of pushback because folks don't understand each other. And so that might be one area of focus. Another one, of course, is gender. It is oftentimes for some organization, another organization I'm thinking about now, they're an organization that's focused on the LGBT issues, but they're also focusing on race because they're an organization that's traditionally focused on white gay men. And so now they're trying to figure out, how do we focus on other racial groups that we need to also reach out to in our work. And so it depends on the organization, but I usually ask them to focus on no more than 3 areas, because what I found with a lot of organizations is their heart's in the right place, but they thin themselves out so much they're covering way too many things. So they're trying to boil the ocean. And what they really need to do is be attentive to the things that you want to focus on, but by prioritizing the top 3, like race, gender, and generation, you focus on that for the next year, maybe, or 2 or 3, and really hyper focus on and dig deep into your understanding and all that. And then as you've come to a place where you feel like, okay, we've made some accomplishments around that, we've done some hiring, and we've tried to change the organization in some real meaningful ways. What are some other areas that need to be attended to? And really kind of do that. In that way, what you find is that you're attending to a lot of different things that really center the organization instead of diffusing their efforts too thinly. Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially the part about not stretching yourself too thin, about being very conscious of your resources. Yeah. So yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I believe. Let's see. That may have been the last question. So this is a last call of sorts for those that want to enter any questions into the group chat. Let's see if there any came through. Yeah, or if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead and just pause for a second as I look through the comments, see if there's any last minute questions coming through. And Angel?
Yes, I do. I actually did get one more question based on what you just said, Kazique. So when you were mentioning that companies should focus on certain initiatives such as race, gender, and generation, would you, I guess, like, I'm thinking specifically for my company, the way that right now we're planning on moving forward is more on looking at programs individually. So for example, like employee feedback or reviewing the qualifications under the hiring process. But do you think that it's a little bit more, it would be more successful if we focus it in the way that you're saying to take the initiative approach, so that we know what we're looking for when we're reviewing qualifications and things like that?
Yeah, and I would say it's and both. It's both of those. But the thing I would be thinking about, and this is just my own personal approach, everyone has a different approach. One of the things I'll be trying to figure out is, how prepared is your organization to actually tackle something like hiring practices? How well positioned are they actually able to tackle employee resource groups or programs or projects? The reason why I ask that question, because sometimes people will say, hey, we want to hire more people, brown and black folks, but they don't have the talent nor the insight or the leadership necessary to make that come to fruition. So even though they try to do it, they fail at it, and then say, well, that wasn't the right goal, or or they get bored, or they get frustrated and then do something else. And the real issue wasn't that the goal they had was the problem. They didn't have the skill sets that are necessary to achieve it. And so sometimes you have to step back 10 steps and do the pre-work that's necessary so you can actually accomplish the goal that you've set for yourself. And so what I would be thinking about is the training that needs to happen first. Do you have a common language that everyone understands? Do you have a sense of where each individual is in their own personal journey around this? Where is the organization as a whole around the climate of this conversation? Because as you tackle the programs, as you tackle the initiatives you're talking about, you're going to run into some foreseeable blockages and pushback. If you had a good assessment to tell you where your organization is, it will help you predict what those challenges are, but also identify what the strengths are so you can capitalize on those. And so to me, it's like stepping back and saying, okay, what are we actually prepared for before we start tackling these things? And do we have what it needs? Because sometimes people, their heart's in the right place. It's like, their heart's so in the right place, but they don't have the skills to do it. And that's why they hire someone to help them figure that out. Does that help, Angel?
Yes, it does. That was my last question, I promise.
Cool. No, it's all good. I like questions. Thank you.
Great. Yes, thank you so much, Angel. Okay, it looks like we are approaching time. Certainly, Kazique, thank you so much for being our gracious presenter, our speaker, our resident psychologist for the past hour and a half. For the benefit of those online, where can they follow you? Where can they keep up with your story? And if you, of course, like to put in the chat any of your platforms, certainly, we'd like to, of course, stay in touch, as I'm sure everyone who joined this wonderful webinar.
Yeah, I'm definitely on LinkedIn. Kazique, it's spelled on the screen. You can find me there. Feel free to reach out there. Only one I'm not on, it feels like, is TikTok. Maybe I need to get an intern to help me with that. But I'm on Instagram as Jelani Consult. Also on Facebook, you can find me there and my business as well. So feel free to reach out. That's where I do a lot of communication with folks. But my webpage is Jelani, JELANI, Austin.com. JelaniAustin.com. And you can stay abreast of, I have a blog. It's called Equity Turned Up. And I do a lot of posts on different subjects, not just through my email, but also through LinkedIn on different subjects. And so you can follow me that way. New product I actually have that's out actually online already. It's called Cards for Belonging and Inclusion. Really excited about the card deck. It's spent a lot of time with a partner whose name is Erin Heckhock. She had a game called Cards for Connection. And my thought and my idea was to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we worked together for several months putting that card game together, and we're really proud of what we put together. And if you're interested in purchasing a game for your organization or for yourself, it's the opposite of Cards Against Humanity, if you want an idea. It's really a good way of connecting with people on some really tough topics, traditionally tough topics. And so I encourage you to go online and purchase a deck for yourself. But that's where you can get me and find me. But thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's been a joy to be with y'all.
Yeah, Kazique, thank you again. And thank you to everyone who attended. A copy, this webinar will be available on our YHPAA website. Just a few things, of course, we want to stay in touch with everyone who was able to join us and who is also anyone who may be watching the playback of this webinar. So be sure to follow us at YHPAA, YHPAA. Those are our handles for Facebook and Instagram, as well as Twitter. And then also we want to bring to everyone's attention our annual gala, which this year looks a little bit different because of the pandemic, because of social distancing, stay-at-home orders. That will take place on October 10th. That is posted on our media, our social media, as well as our website. So we invite everyone to go ahead and check that out and join us if you are available. Kazique, thank you again for everything. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and we wish you a good night. And and hope to see you again in the future. Thanks again.